everyone, Wayne from the CERN and Earth and Space Center here. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at some objects in our solar system that aren't quite planets, but aren't quite just asteroids or other little things either. We call them dwarf planets, and the most famous of those you can see behind me, and that is the dwarf planet Pluto. I will talk a little bit about what changed with Pluto. Hint, it's not really anything, just what we call it. And we'll take a look at some of the other interesting dwarf planets that we can find in our solar system. I'm not going to show you where to find them in the sky because, well, they really can't unless you have a super-powered telescope and know exactly where you need to look. You can't see them with just your eyes or binoculars, so I'm not going to worry too much about where they're at in the night sky tonight or anytime. Instead, we'll just jump in and fly out and take a look at them up close and personal. So let's leave Earth and we will start our tour of dwarf planets by flying to the first dwarf planet that was discovered, and that is Pluto. Now, Pluto was discovered way back in 1930, almost by accident. They were looking for the mysterious planet X, and Clyde Tombaugh was looking at some slides from a telescope and saw something very faint that was moving very slightly in one of the slides of the telescope, and figured out that it was an object way out in the far reaches of the solar system, and it was determined to be the ninth planet, Pluto. Now, one of the most popular questions that we get here at the CERN and Earth and Space Center is, what happened to Pluto? Why isn't it a planet anymore? Where did it go? Well, it didn't go anywhere. It's still there, as we can see it fly into view here. Pluto is still out there with its 5 moons, and nothing really changed about Pluto. It's in the same spot it was. It's still the same thing that it was. The only thing that changed is what we call it. Now, we called it a planet at first, but what happened is we started to discover a lot more things that were quite like Pluto and not like the other 8 planets. Now, Pluto wasn't quite like the other 8 planets either, but for a long time it was just kind of the odd one out. But we started discovering some other small objects in our solar system that didn't quite fit in with the 8 classical planets. And we're going to visit some of those right now. We'll take a look at Ceres. We'll fly towards that dwarf planet. Ceres was discovered in the asteroid belt, and at first it was thought to be just, well, the biggest of the asteroids. And it is the biggest of the asteroids, but it's so much bigger than most of the other asteroids that it stuck out. It was a little bit different. And finding Ceres, which we're flying up to here in just a moment, started to get us to think about, well, what else is out there that's kind of like a planet, but maybe not quite. And they started to find a lot more. In the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, we started discovering lots of objects that we call planetoids. And they're not quite planets, not quite asteroids or comets. They're just a little bit different. So here we see Ceres in the asteroid belt flying around. And what really got us to change our definitions of what makes a planet and what doesn't was the dwarf planet Eris. And we'll fly out to Eris right now. So as we were finding all of these other objects, these smaller objects, these planetoids in our solar system, all of them were pretty significantly smaller than Pluto. So they were all just considered to be these planetoid objects, and Pluto was still the 9th and smallest of the planets. But then we found Eris, which we're flying towards right now. Now, Eris is in the Kuiper Belt, around the same area of the solar system as Pluto, and it's pretty close to the same size as Pluto, maybe even just that little tiny bit bigger, very, very close in size to Pluto. Now, if this one had a similar orbit and similar size to Pluto, and Pluto was a planet, well, then how come Eris shouldn't be a planet? Is Eris the 10th planet? If Eris is a planet, then how about Ceres in the asteroid belt? It's not too much smaller. It has an orbit around the sun. Should that one be considered a planet as well? And what about some of these other objects that we found? Things like Maki Maki and Quarwar and Haumea. should these all be considered planets? What if we keep on discovering them? Are they all going to be considered planets? And in 2006, the International Astronomical Union, which is a group of astronomers and astrophysicists who really decide on what things are called in outer space, got together and they held a vote on whether or not we should call these objects planets or dwarf planets or planetoids. And they came up with some rules for a cutoff. Now, there is a cutoff for dwarf planets and planets. Now, planet has to orbit around the sun, and in order to meet the cutoff, there are 3 criteria it needs to have. It needs to orbit around the sun, it needs to be large enough to form itself into a sphere, and it needs to be able to clear out its own orbit. Now, that means it needs to be big enough that anything that is in its path will be either thrown out or destroyed as it goes around. And so that qualified Ceres and Eris and some of these other objects as dwarf planets because they couldn't clear out their own orbits, and dwarf planets like Haumea, which we'll fly to now, aren't really big enough to form themselves into a sphere. Haumea is actually kind of egg-shaped, and we'll see that in just a second. But it also disqualified Pluto from being a planet because it could not clear out its own orbit. Now, Pluto's orbit does cross with the orbit of the planet Neptune, and so far, it takes a long time for both of them to go around, and they haven't crashed into each other yet. Here we see Haumea and its strange sort of squashed egg shape. But since Pluto and Neptune cross orbits, if they were to be in the same area at the same time, well, Neptune would win that battle every time. It would either break up Pluto and destroy it, or cast it out of the solar system entirely due to its gravity. So that qualified Pluto as a dwarf planet, and it just changed what we call it. And the reason for this change was just that, so that we can understand what to call things, so that when we're talking about them in the scientific community, everyone knows what you're talking about. So when some people say Pluto is still a planet, that's fine. You can consider it a planet if you like. It is still out there in our solar system. It doesn't really change anything. But if you're writing a scientific paper on dwarf planets and Pluto, it would probably make a lot more sense to call Pluto a dwarf planet, just so everyone knows the definitions that you're using. Now, another thing that makes Pluto very interesting as we fly back out towards it now is it has a lot of moons for a dwarf planet. It has 5 moons, and the largest of those moons is called Charon. And Charon and Pluto almost make up a binary dwarf planet system. They're both relatively big compared to each other, and they orbit around each other. So as they spin around in space, the point that they orbit around is actually in between those 2 objects. So here we see Pluto once more, and then if we turn and take a look at Charon, we'll see that the point that they kind of orbit around each other is in between those 2 objects, and they just kind of spin around like they were going around an empty point in space. And that's a little bit of backstory on what makes a dwarf planet instead of a regular planet, and what happened to Pluto back in 2006. Well, thank you everyone for watching our video about Pluto and the other dwarf planets. Now, there could be more dwarf planets found at any time. They are very small and very far away from the sun for the most part, so they're rather difficult to find, and new discoveries are being made all the time. So keep your eye out on the news for any new dwarf planets that might be out there. And until then, my name is Wayne from the Southern Earth and Space Center, and remember to get out there and take a look at your night skies.